Beautiful Stories from Shakespeare, as written by E Nesbit. The Tempest. Prospero, the Duke of Milan, was a learned and studious man who lived among his books, leaving the management of his dukedom to his brother Antonio, in whom indeed he had complete trust. But that trust was ill rewarded, for Antonio wanted to wear the duke's crown himself and to gain his ends, and would have killed his brother but for the love the people bore him. However, with the help of Prospero's great enemy, Alonso, King of Naples, he managed to get into his hands the dukedom with all its honour, power and riches. For they took Prospero to sea, and when they were far away from land, forced him into a little boat with no tackle, mast or sail. In their cruelty and hatred, they put his little daughter, Miranda, not yet 3 years old, into the boat with him, and sailed away, leaving them to their fate. But one among the courtiers with Antonio was true to his rightful master Prospero. To save the Duke from his enemies was impossible, but much could be done to remind him of a subject's love. So this worthy lord, whose name was Gonzalo, secretly placed in the boat some fresh water, provisions and clothes, and what Prospero valued most of all, some of his precious books. The boat was cast on an island, and Prospero and his little one landed in safety. Now this island was enchanted, and for years had lain under the spell of a fell witch, Sycorax, who had imprisoned in the trunks of trees all the good spirits she found there. She died shortly before Prospero was cast on those shores, but the spirits, of whom Ariel was the chief, still remained in their prisons. Prospero was a great magician, for he had devoted himself almost entirely to the study of magic during the years in which he allowed his brother to manage the affairs of Milan. By his art he set free the imprisoned spirits, yet kept them obedient to his will, and they were more truly his subjects than his people in Milan had been. For he treated them kindly as long as they did his bidding, and he exercised his power over them wisely and well. One creature alone he found it necessary to treat with harshness. This was Caliban, the son of the wicked old witch, a hideous, deformed monster, horrible to look on, and vicious and brutal in his habits. When Miranda was grown up into a maiden, sweet and fair for all to see, it chanced that Antonio and Alonso, with Sebastian his brother and Ferdinand his son, were at sea together with old Gonzalo, and their ship came near Prospero's island. Prospero, knowing they were there, raised by his art a great storm, so that even the sailors on board gave themselves up for lost, and first among them all Prince Ferdinand leapt into the sea, and, as his father thought in his grief, was drowned. But Ariel brought him safe ashore, and all the rest of the crew, although they were washed overboard, were landed unhurt in different parts of the island, and the good ship herself, which they all thought had been wrecked, lay at anchor in the harbour whither Ariel had brought her. Such wonders could Prospero and his spirits perform. While yet the tempest was raging, Prospero showed his daughter the brave ship labouring in the trough of the sea, and told her that it was filled with living human beings like themselves. She, in pity of their lives, praised him who had raised this storm to quell it. Then her father bade her to have no fear, for he intended to save every one of them. Then, for the first time, he told her the story of his life and hers, and that he had caused this storm to rise in order that his enemies, Antonio and Alonso, who were on board, might be delivered into his hands. When he had made an end of his story, he charmed her into sleep, for Ariel was at hand, and he had work for him to do. Ariel, who longed for his complete freedom, grumbled to be kept in drudgery, but on being threateningly reminded of all the sufferings he had undergone when Sycorax ruled in the land, and of the debt of gratitude he owed to the master who had made those sufferings to end, he ceased to complain, and promised faithfully to do whatever Prospero might command. "Do so," said Prospero, "and in 2 days I will discharge thee." Then he bade Ariel take the form of a water nymph, and sent him in search of the young prince. And Ariel, invisible to Ferdinand, hovered near him, singing the while, "Come unto these yellow sands, and then take these hands. Curtsied when you have, and kissed, the wild waves whist, foot in fleetly here and there, and sweet sprites the burden bear." And Ferdinand followed the magic singing, as the song changed into a solemn air, and the words brought grief to his heart and tears to his eyes, for thus they ran: "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones a coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell, hark, now I hear them, ding dong bell." And so singing, Ariel led the spellbound prince into the presence of Prospero and Miranda. Then, behold, all happened as Prospero desired, for Miranda, who had never, since she could first remember, seen any human being save her father, looked on at the youthful prince with reverence in her eyes and love in her secret heart. "I might call him," she said, "a thing divine, for nothing natural I ever saw so noble." And Ferdinand, beholding her beauty with wonder and delight, exclaimed, "Most sure the goddesses on whom these airs attend." Nor did he attempt to hide the passion which she inspired in him, for scarcely had they exchanged a dozen sentences before he vowed to make her his queen if she were willing. But Prospero, though secretly delighted, pretended wrath. "You come here as a spy," he said to Ferdinand. "I will manacle your neck and feet together, and you shall feed on fresh water mussels, withered roots and husk, and have sea water to drink. Follow." "No," said Ferdinand, and drew his sword. But on the instant Prospero charmed him, so that he stood there like a statue, still as stone, and Miranda in terror prayed her father to have mercy on her lover, but he harshly refused her, and made Ferdinand follow him to his cell. There he set the prince to work, making him remove thousands of heavy logs of timber and pile them up, and Ferdinand patiently obeyed, and thought his toil all too well repaid by the sympathy of the sweet Miranda. She in very pity would have helped him in his hard work, but he would not let her, yet he could not keep from her the secret of his love, and she, hearing it, rejoiced and promised to be his wife. Then Prospero released him from his servitude, and glad at heart he gave his consent to their marriage. "Take her," he said, "she is thine own." In the meantime, Antonio and Sebastian, in another part of the island, were plotting the murder of Alonso, the King of Naples. For Ferdinand being dead, as they thought, Sebastian would succeed to the throne on Alonso's death, and they would have carried out their wicked purpose while their victim was asleep, but that Ariel woke him in good time. Many tricks did Ariel play on them. Once he set a banquet before them, and just as they were going to fall to, he appeared to them amid thunder and lightning in the form of a harpy, and immediately the banquet disappeared. Then Ariel upbraided them with their sins and vanished too. Prospero, by his enchantments, drew them all to the grove without his cell, where they waited, trembling and afraid, and now at last bitterly repenting them of their sins. Prospero determined to make one last use of his magic power, and then, said he, "I'll break my staff, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book." So he made heavenly music to sound in the air, and appeared to them in his proper shape as the Duke of Milan. Because they repented, he forgave them, and told them the story of his life since they had cruelly committed him and his baby daughter to the mercy of wind and wave. Alonso, who seemed sorriest of all for his past crimes, lamented the loss of his heir. But Prospero drew back a curtain and showed them Ferdinand and Miranda playing at chess. Great was Alonso's joy to greet his loved son again, and when he heard that the fair maiden with whom Alonso was playing was Prospero's daughter, and that the young folks had plighted their troth, he said, "Give me your hands, let grief and sorrow still embrace this heart that doth not wish you joy." So all ended happily. The ship was safe in the harbour, and the next day they all set sail for Naples, where Ferdinand and Miranda were to be married. Ariel gave them calm seas and auspicious gales, and many were the rejoicings at the wedding. Then Prospero, after many years of absence, went back to his own dukedom, where he was welcomed with great joy by his faithful subjects. He practised the arts of magic no more, but his life was happy, and not only because he had found his own again, but chiefly because, when his bitterest foes who had done him deadly wrong lay at his mercy, he took no vengeance on them, but nobly forgave them. As for Ariel, Prospero made him free as air, so that he could wander where he would, and sing with a light heart his sweet song. Where the bee sucks, there suck I, in a cowslip spell I lie. There I crouch when owls do cry, on the bat's back I do fly, after summer merrily. Merrily, merrily shall I live now, under the blossom that hangs on the bough. As You Like It. There was once a wicked duke named Frederick, who took the dukedom that should have belonged to his brother, sending him into exile. His brother went into the forest of Arden, where he lived the life of a bold forester, as Robin Hood did in Sherwood in merry England. The banished duke's daughter, Rosalind, remained with Celia, Frederick's daughter, and the two loved each other more than most sisters. One day there was a wrestling match at court, and Rosalind and Celia went to see it. Charles, a celebrated wrestler, was there, who had killed many men in contests of this kind. Orlando, the young man he was to wrestle with, was so slender and youthful that Rosalind and Celia thought he would surely be killed. as others had been. So they spoke to him, and asked him not to attempt so dangerous an adventure. But the only effect of their words was to make him wish more to come off well in the encounter, so as to win praise from such sweet ladies. Orlando, like Rosalind's father, was being kept out of his inheritance by his brother, and was so sad at his brother's unkindness that until he saw Rosalind he did not care much whether he lived or died. But now the sight of the fair Rosalind gave him strength and courage, so that he did marvellously, and at last threw Charles to such a tune that the wrestler had to be carried off the ground. Duke Frederick was pleased with his courage, and asked his name. "My name is Orlando, and I am the youngest son of Sir Rowland de Boys," said the young man. Now Sir Rowland de Boys, when he was alive, had been a good friend to the banished Duke, so that Frederick heard with regret whose son Orlando was, and would not befriend him. But Rosalind was delighted to hear that this handsome young stranger was the son of her father's old friend, and as they were going away, she turned back more than once to say another kind word to the brave young man. "Gentleman," she said, giving him a chain from her neck, "wear this for me. I could give more, but that my hand lacks means." Rosalind and Celia, when they were alone, began to talk about the handsome wrestler, and Rosalind confessed that she loved him at first sight. "Come, come," said Celia, "wrestle with thy affections." "Oh," answered Rosalind, "they take the part of a better wrestler than myself. Look, here comes the Duke." "With his eyes full of anger," said Celia. "You must leave court at once," he said to Rosalind. "Why?" she asked. "Never mind why," answered the Duke. "You are banished. If within 10 days you are found within 20 miles of my court, you die." So Rosalind set out to seek her father, the banished Duke, in the forest of Arden. Celia loved her too much to let her go alone, and as it was rather a dangerous journey, Rosalind, being the taller, dressed up as a young countryman, and her cousin as a country girl, and Rosalind said that she should be called Ganymede, and Celia Alenia. They were very tired when at last they came to the forest of Arden, and as they were sitting on the grass, a countryman passed that way, and Ganymede asked him if he could get them food. He did so, and told them that a shepherd's flocks and house were to be sold. They bought these and settled down as shepherd and shepherdess in the forest. In the meantime, Oliver, having sought to take his brother Orlando's life, Orlando also wandered into the forest, and there met with the rightful Duke, and being kindly received, stayed with him. Now Orlando could think of nothing but Rosalind, and he went about the forest, carving her name on the trees, and writing love sonnets, and hanging them on bushes. And there Rosalind and Celia found them. One day Orlando met them, but he did not know Rosalind in her boy's clothes, though he liked the pretty shepherd youth, because he fancied a likeness in him to her he loved. "There is a foolish lover," said Rosalind, "who haunts these woods and hangs sonnets on trees. If I could find him, I would soon cure him of his folly." Orlando confessed that he was the foolish lover, and Rosalind said, "If you will come and see me every day, I will pretend to be Rosalind, and I will take her part and be wayward and contrary, as is the way of women, till I make you ashamed of your folly in loving her." So every day he went to her house, and took a pleasure in saying to her all the pretty things he would have said to Rosalind, and she had the fine and secret joy of knowing that his love words came to the right ears. Thus many days passed pleasantly away. One morning, as Orlando was going to visit Ganymede, he saw a man asleep on the ground, and that there was a lioness crouching near, waiting for the man who was asleep to wake. For they say that lions will not prey on anything that is dead or sleeping. Then Orlando looked at the man and saw that it was his wicked brother Oliver, who had tried to take his life. He fought the lioness and killed her, and saved his brother's life. While Orlando was fighting the lioness, Oliver woke to see his brother, whom he had treated so badly, saving him from a wild beast at the risk of his own life. This made him repent of his wickedness, and he begged Orlando's pardon, and from thenceforth they were dear brothers. The lioness wounded Orlando's arm so much that he could not go to see the shepherd, so he sent his brother to ask Ganymede to come with him. Oliver went and told the whole story to Ganymede and Alenia, and Alenia was so charmed with his manly way of confessing his faults that she fell in love with him at once. But when Ganymede heard of the danger that Orlando had been in, she fainted, and when she came to herself, said truly enough, "I should have been a woman by right." Oliver went back to his brother and told him all this, saying, "I love Alenia so well that I will give up my estates to you and marry her, and live here as a shepherd." "Let your wedding be tomorrow," said Orlando, "and I will ask the Duke and his friends." When Orlando told Ganymede how his brother was to be married on the morrow, he added, "Oh, how bitter a thing it is to look into happiness through another man's eyes." Then answered Rosalind, still in Ganymede's dress, and speaking with his voice, "If you do love Rosalind so near the heart, then when your brother marries Alenia, shall you marry her?" Now the next day the Duke and his followers, and Orlando and Oliver and Alenia were all gathered together for the wedding. Then Ganymede came in and said to the Duke, "If I bring in your daughter Rosalind, will you give her to Orlando here?" "That I would," said the Duke, "if I had all kingdoms to give with her." "And you say you will have her when I bring her?" she said to Orlando. "That I would," he answered, "were I king of all kingdoms." Then Rosalind and Celia went out, and Rosalind put on her pretty woman's clothes again, and after a while came back. She turned to her father. "I give myself to you, for I am yours." "If there be truth in sight," he said, "you are my daughter." Then she said to Orlando, "I give myself to you, for I am yours." "If there be truth in sight," he said, "you are my Rosalind." "I will have no father if you be not he," said she to the Duke, "and to Orlando, I will have no husband if you be not he." So Orlando and Rosalind were married, and Oliver and Celia, and they lived happy ever after, returning with the Duke to the kingdom. For Frederick had been shown by a holy hermit the wickedness of his ways, and so gave back the dukedom of his brother, and himself went into a monastery to pray for forgiveness. The wedding was a merry one in the mossy glades of the forest. A shepherd and a shepherdess who had been friends with Rosalind when she was herself disguised as a shepherd were married on the same day, and all with such pretty feastings and merry-makings as could be nowhere within 4 walls, but only in the beautiful green wood. Twelfth Night. Orsino, the Duke of Illyria, was deeply in love with a beautiful countess named Olivia. Yet was all his love in vain, for she disdained his suit, and when her brother died, she sent back a messenger from the Duke, bidding him to tell his master that for 7 years she would not let the very air behold her face, but that like a nun she would walk veiled, and all this for the sake of a dead brother's love, which she would keep fresh and lasting in her sad remembrance. The Duke longed for someone to whom he could tell his sorrow, and repeat over and over again the story of his love. and chance brought him such a companion. For about this time a goodly ship was wrecked on the Illyrian coast, and among those who reached land in safety were the captain and a fair young maid named Viola. But she was little grateful for being rescued from the perils of the sea, since she feared that her twin brother was drowned, Sebastian, as dear to her as the heart in her bosom, and so like her, but for the difference in their manner of dress, one could hardly be told from the other. The captain, for her comfort, told her that he had seen her brother bind himself to a strong mast that lived upon the sea, and that thus there was hope that he might be saved. Viola now asked in whose country she was, and learning that the young Duke Orsino ruled there, and was as noble in his nature as in his name, she decided to disguise herself in male attire and seek for employment with him as a page. In this she succeeded, and now from day to day she had to listen to the story of Orsino's love. At first she sympathized very truly with him, but soon her sympathy grew to love. At last it occurred to Orsino that his hopeless love suit might prosper better if he sent this pretty lad to woo Olivia for him. Viola unwillingly went on this errand, but when she came to the house, Malvolio, Olivia's steward, a vain, officious man, sick, as his mistress told him, of self-love, forbade the messenger admittance. Viola, however, who was now called Cesario, refused to take any denial, and vowed to have speech with the Countess. Olivia, hearing how her instructions were defied, and curious to see this daring youth, said, "We'll once more hear Orsino's embassy." When Viola was admitted to her presence, and the servants had been sent away, she listened patiently to the reproaches which this bold messenger from the Duke poured upon her, and listening she fell in love with the supposed Cesario. And when Cesario had gone, Olivia longed to send some love token after him. So, calling Malvolio, she bade him follow the boy. "He left this ring behind him," she said, taking one from her finger. "Tell him I will none of it." Malvolio did as he was bid, and then Viola, who of course knew perfectly well that she had left no ring behind her, saw with a woman's quickness that Olivia loved her. Then she went back to the Duke, very sad at heart for her lover, and for Olivia, and for herself. But it was cold comfort she could give Orsino, who now sought to ease the pangs of despised love by listening to sweet music, while Cesario stood by his side. "Ah," said the Duke to his page that night, "you too have been in love." "A little," answered Viola. "What kind of woman is it?" he asked. "Of your complexion," she answered. "What years, i'faith?" was his next question. To this came the pretty answer, "About your years, my lord." "Oh, too old, by heaven!" cried the Duke. "Let still the woman take an elder than herself." And Viola very meekly said, "I think it is well, my lord." By and by Orsino begged Cesario once more to visit Olivia and to plead his love suit, but she, thinking to dissuade him, said, "If some lady loved you as you loved Olivia—" "Ah, that cannot be," said the Duke. "But I know," Olivia went on, "what love woman may have for a man. My father had a daughter loved a man, as it might be," she added, blushing. "Perhaps, were I a woman, I should love your lordship." "And what is her history?" he asked. "A blank, my lord," Viola answered. "She never told her love, but let concealment like a worm in the bud feed on her damask cheek. She pined in thought, and with a green and yellow melancholy she sat, like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief. Was not this love indeed? But died thy sister of her love, my boy?" the Duke asked, and Viola, who had all the time been telling her own love for him in this pretty fashion, said, "I am all the daughters my father has, and all the brothers, sir. Shall I go to the lady?" "To her in haste," said the Duke, at once forgetting all about the story, "and give her this jewel." So Viola went, and this time poor Olivia was unable to hide her love, and openly confessed it with such passionate truth that Viola left her hastily, saying, "Never more will I deplore my master's tears to you." But in vowing this, Viola did not know the tender pity she would feel for the other's suffering. So when Olivia, in the violence of her love, sent a messenger praying Cesario to visit her once more, Cesario had no heart to refuse the request. But the favours which Olivia bestowed upon this mere page aroused the jealousy of Sir Andrew Aguecheek, a foolish, rejected lover of hers, who at the time was staying at her house with her merry old uncle Sir Toby. This same Sir Toby dearly loved a practical joke, and knowing Sir Andrew to be an arrogant coward, he thought that if he could bring off a duel between him and Cesario, there would be a rare sport indeed. So he induced Sir Andrew to send a challenge which he himself took to Cesario. The poor page in great terror said, "I will return again to the house. I am no fighter." "Back you shall not to the house," said Sir Toby, "unless you fight me first." And as he looked a very fierce old gentleman, Viola thought it best to await Sir Andrew's coming, and when he at last made his appearance, in a great fright, if the truth be known, she tremblingly drew her sword, and Sir Andrew in like fear followed her example. Happily for them both, at this moment some officers of the court came on scene and stopped the intended duel. Viola gladly made off with what speed she might, while Sir Toby called after her, "A very paltry boy, and more a coward than a hare." Now while these things were happening, Sebastian had escaped all the dangers of the deep, and had landed safely in Illyria, where he determined to make his way to the Duke's court. On his way thither he passed Olivia's house, just as Viola had left it in such a hurry, and whom should he meet but Sir Andrew and Sir Toby? Sir Andrew, mistaking Sebastian for the cowardly Cesario, took his courage in both hands, and walking up to him, struck him, saying, "There's for you." "Why, there's for you, and there, said Sebastian, hitting back a great deal harder, and again, till Sir Toby came to the rescue of his old friend. Sebastian, however, tore himself free from Sir Toby's clutches, and drawing his sword would have fought them both, but that Olivia herself, having heard the quarrel, came running in, and with many reproaches sent Sir Toby and his friend away. Then turning to Sebastian, whom she too thought to be Cesario, she besought him with many a pretty speech to come into the house with her. Sebastian, half dazed and all delighted with her beauty and grace, readily consented, and that very day so great was Olivia's haste that they were married before she had discovered that he was not Cesario, or Sebastian was quite certain whether or not he was in a dream. Meanwhile Orsino, hearing how ill Cesario fared with Olivia, visited her himself, taking Cesario with him. Olivia met them both before the door, and seeing, as she thought, her husband there, reproached him for leaving her, while to the Duke she said that his suit was fat and wholesome to her as howling after music. "Still so cruel?" said Orsino. "Still so constant," she answered. Then Orsino's anger growing too cruelly, he vowed that, to be revenged on her, he would kill Cesario, whom he knew she loved. "Come, boy," he said to the page, And Viola, following him as he moved away, said, I, to do you rest, 1,000 deaths would die. A great fear took hold on Olivia, and she cried aloud, Cesario, husband, stay! Her husband? Asked the Duke angrily. No, my lord, not I, said Viola. Call forth the Holy Father, cried Olivia. And the priest who had married Sebastian and Olivia came in, declaring Cesario to be the bridegroom. O thou dissembling cub, the Duke exclaimed, farewell and take her, but go where thou and I henceforth may never meet. At this moment Sir Andrew came up with bleeding crown, complaining that Cesario had broken his head, and Toby's as well. I never hurt you, said Viola very positively. You drew your sword on me, but I bespoke you fair, and hurt you not. Yet for all her protesting, no one there believed her, but all their thoughts were on a sudden changed to wonder when Sebastian came in. I am sorry, madam, he said to his wife. I have hurt your kinsman. Pardon me, sweet, even for the vows we made each other so late ago. One face, one voice, one habit, and 2 persons, cried the Duke, looking first at Olivia and then at Sebastian. An apple cleft in 2, said one who knew Sebastian, is not more twin than these 2 creatures. Which is Sebastian? I never had a brother, said Sebastian. I had a sister, whom the blind waves and surges have devoured. Were you a woman, he said to Viola, I should let my tears fall upon your cheek, and say, Thrice welcome, drowned Viola. Then Viola, rejoicing to see her dear brother alive, confessed that she was indeed his sister Viola. As she spoke, Orsino felt the pity that is akin to love. Boy, he said, thou hast said to me 1,000 times thou shouldst love woman like me. And all those sayings I will o'erswear, Viola replied, and all those swearings keep true. Give me thy hand, Orsino cried in gladness. Thou shalt be my wife, and my fancy's queen. And thus was the gentle Viola made happy, while Olivia found in Sebastian a constant lover and good husband, and he in her a true and loving wife. Romeo and Juliet. Once upon a time there lived in Verona 2 great families named Montague and Capulet. They were both rich, and I suppose they were as sensible in most things as other rich people. But in one thing they were extremely silly. There was an old quarrel between the 2 families, and instead of making it up like reasonable folks, they made a sort of pet of their quarrel, and would not let it die out. so that a Montague couldn't speak to a Capulet if he met one in the street, nor a Capulet to a Montague, or if they did speak, it was to say rude and unpleasant things, which often ended in a fight, and their relations and servants were just as foolish, so that street fights and duels and uncomfortableness of that kind were always growing out of the Montague and Capulet quarrel. Now Lord Capulet, the head of that family, gave a party, a grand supper and a dance, and he was so hospitable that he said anyone might come to it, except, of course, the Montagues. But there was a young Montague named Romeo, who very much wanted to be there, because Rosaline, the lady he loved, had been asked. This lady had never been at all kind to him, and he had no reason to love her. But the fact was that he wanted to love somebody, and as he hadn't seen the right lady, he was obliged to love the wrong one. So to the Capulets' grand party he came with his friends Mercutio and Benvolio. Old Capulet welcomed him and his two friends very kindly, and the young Romeo moved about among the crowd of courtly folk dressed in their velvets and satins, the men with jewelled sword hilts and collars, and the ladies with brilliant gems on breasts and arms, and stones of price set in their bright girdles. Romeo was in his best too, and though he wore a black mask over his eyes and nose, everyone could see by his mouth and his hair and the way he held his head that he was 12 times handsomer than anyone else in the room. Presently, amid the dancers, he saw a lady so beautiful and so lovable that from that moment he never again gave one thought to that Rosaline whom he thought he loved. And he looked at this other fair lady as she moved in the dance in her white satin and pearls, and all the world seemed vain and worthless to him compared with her. And he was saying this, or something like it, when Tybalt, Lady Capulet's nephew, hearing his voice, knew him to be Romeo. Tybalt, being very angry, went at once to his uncle and told him how a Montague had come uninvited to the feast. But old Capulet was too fine a gentleman to be discourteous to any man under his own roof, and he bade Tybalt be quiet. But this young man only waited for a chance to quarrel with Romeo. In the meantime, Romeo made his way to the fair lady and told her in sweet words that he loved her and kissed her. Just then her mother sent for her, and then Romeo found out that the lady on whom he had set his heart's hopes was Juliet, the daughter of Lord Capulet, his sworn foe. So he went away sorrowing indeed, but loving her none the less. So Juliet said to her nurse, "Who was that gentleman that would not dance?" His name is Romeo under Montague, the only son of your great enemy," answered the nurse. Then Juliet went to her room and looked out of her window over the beautiful green-grey garden where the moon was shining. And Romeo was hidden in that garden among the trees, because he could not bear to go right away without trying to see her again. So she, not knowing him to be there, spoke her secret thought aloud and told the quiet garden how she loved Romeo. And Romeo heard and was glad beyond measure. Hidden below he looked up and saw her fair face in the moonlight, framed in the blossoming creepers that grew around her window. And as he looked and listened, he felt as though he had been carried away in a dream and set down by some magician in that beautiful and enchanted garden. "Ah, why are you called Romeo?" said Juliet. "Since I love you, what does it matter what you are called?" "Call me but Love, and I'll be new baptized. Henceforth I never will be Romeo," he cried, stepping into the full white moonlight from the shade of the cypresses and orlandias that had hidden him. She was frightened at first, but when she saw that it was Romeo himself and no stranger, she too was glad, and he standing in the garden below, and she leaning from the window, they spoke long together, each one trying to find the sweetest words in the world to make that pleasant talk that lovers use. And the tale of all they said and the sweet music their voices made together is set down in a golden book, where you children may read it for yourselves some day. And the time passed so quickly, as it does for folk who love each other and are together, that when the time came to part, it seemed as though they had met but that moment, and indeed they hardly knew how to part. "I will send to you tomorrow," said Juliet. And so, at last, with lingering and longing, they said goodbye. Juliet went into her room, and a dark curtain hid her bright window. Romeo went away through the still and dewy garden like a man in a dream. The next morning, very early, Romeo went to Friar Lawrence, a priest, and telling him all the story, begged him to marry him to Juliet without delay. And this, after some talk, the priest consented to. So when Juliet sent her old nurse to Romeo that day to know what he proposed to do, the old woman took back a message that all was well, and that all things ready for the marriage of Juliet and Romeo on the next morning. The young lovers were afraid to ask their parents' consent to their marriage, as young people should do, because of this foolish old quarrel between the Capulets and the Montagues. And Friar Lawrence was willing to help the young lovers secretly, because he thought that when they were once married, their parents might soon be told, and that the match might put a happy end to the old quarrel. So the next morning early, Romeo and Juliet were married at Friar Lawrence's cell, and parted with tears and kisses. And Romeo promised to come into the garden that evening, and the nurse got ready a rope ladder to let down from the window, so that Romeo could climb up and talk to his dear wife quietly and alone. But that very day a dreadful thing happened. Tybalt, the young man who had been so vexed at Romeo's going to the Capulets' feast, met him and his two friends, Mercutio and Benvolio, in the street, called Romeo a villain, and asked him to fight. Romeo had no wish to fight with Juliet's cousin, but Mercutio drew his sword, and he and Tybalt fought, and Mercutio was killed. When Romeo saw that his friend was dead, he forgot everything except anger at the man who had killed him, and he and Tybalt fought till Tybalt fell dead. So on the very day of his wedding, Romeo killed his dear Juliet's cousin, and was sentenced to be banished. Poor Juliet and her young husband met that night indeed. He climbed the rope ladder among the flowers and found her window, but their meeting was a sad one, and they parted with bitter tears and hearts heavy, because they could not know when they should meet again. Now Juliet's father, who, of course, had no idea that she was married, wished to wed her to a gentleman named Paris, and was so angry when she refused that she hurried away to ask Friar Lawrence what she should do. He advised her to pretend to consent, and then he said, "I will give you a draught that will make you seem to be dead for 2 days, and then when they take you to church, it will be to bury you, not to marry you. They will put you in the vault thinking you are dead, and before you wake up, Romeo and I will be there to take care of you. Will you do this, or are you afraid?" "I will do it. Talk not to me of fear," said Juliet. And she went home and told her father she would marry Paris. If she had spoken out and told her father the truth, well, then this would be a different story. Lord Capulet was very much pleased to get his own way, and set about inviting his friends and getting the wedding feast ready. Everyone stayed up all night, for there was a great deal to do, and very little time to do it in. Lord Capulet was anxious to get Juliet married, because he saw she was very unhappy. Of course, she was really fretting about her husband Romeo, But her father thought she was grieving for the death of her cousin Tybalt, and he thought marriage would give her something else to think about. Early in the morning the nurse came to call Juliet and to dress her for her wedding, but she would not wake, and at last the nurse cried out, "Alas, alas, help, help, my lady's dead! Oh, well a day that ever I was born!" Lady Capulet came running in, and then Lord Capulet and Lord Paris the bridegroom. There lay Juliet, cold and white and lifeless, and all their weeping could not wake her. So it was a burying that day instead of a marrying. Meantime Father Lawrence sent a messenger to Mantua with a letter to Romeo, telling him of all these things, and that all would have been well, only the messenger was delayed and could not go. But ill news travels fast. Romeo's servant, who knew the secret of the marriage but not of Juliet's pretended death, heard of her funeral and hurried to Mantua to tell Romeo how his young wife was dead and lying in the grave. "Is it so?" cried Romeo, heartbroken. "Then I will lie by Juliet's side tonight." And he bought himself a poison and went straight back to Verona. He hastened to the tomb where Juliet was lying. It was not a grave, but a vault. He broke open the door and was just going down the stone steps that led to the vault where all the dead Capulets lay, when he heard a voice behind him calling him to stop. It was the Lord Paris, who was to have married Juliet that day. "How dare you come here to disturb the dead bodies of the Capulets, you vile Montague?" cried Paris. Poor Romeo, half mad with sorrow, yet tried to answer gently. "You were told," said Paris, "that if you returned to Verona you must die." "I must indeed," said Romeo. "I came here for nothing else. Good, gentle youth, leave me. Oh, go, before I do you any harm. I love you better than myself. Go, leave me here." Then Paris said, "I defy you, and I arrest you as a felon." And Romeo, in his anger and despair, drew his sword. They fought, and Paris was killed. As Romeo's sword pierced him, Paris cried, "Oh, I am slain! If thou be merciful, open the tomb and lay me with Juliet." And Romeo said, "In faith I will." And he carried the dead man into the tomb and laid him by the dear Juliet's side. Then he knelt by Juliet and spoke to her, and he held her in his arms and kissed her cold lips, believing that she was dead, while all the while she was coming nearer and nearer to the time of her awakening. Then he drank the poison and died beside his sweetheart and wife. Now came Friar Lawrence when it was too late, and saw all that had happened, And then poor Juliet woke out of her sleep to find her husband and her friend both dead beside her. The noise of the fight had brought other folks to the place too, and Friar Lawrence, hearing them, ran away, and Juliet was left alone. She saw the cup that had held the poison, and knew how all had happened. And since no poison was left for her, she drew Romeo's sword and thrust it through her heart, and so, falling with her head on Romeo's breast, she died. And here ends the story of these faithful and most unhappy lovers. And when the old folks knew from Friar Lawrence of all that had befallen, they sorrowed exceedingly, and now seeing all the mischief their wicked quarrel had wrought, they repented them of it, and over the bodies of their dead children they clasped hands at last in friendship and forgiveness. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.